Aloha, Molly.
Hello, how are you?
Aloha, Ben. Aloha, Kristen. Travis, yeah, good to see everybody.
Great to see you.
Aloha, everybody.
Hi, we're just going to wait maybe another minute just to let an additional few people join.
Sure.
Okay, all right. Thanks again for all the macadamia candies, guys.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to wait just about 15 more seconds to admit a few more people, and then we'll get started. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon or good morning to those of you signing on from further west. Thank you for joining NCSL's briefing on the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. I'm Molly Ramsdell, Director of NCSL's Washington, D.C. office, and I will be the host of today's program. We have scheduled 60 minutes for our discussion, but the good news is you aren't going to have to listen to me speak for that entire time. I am joined by several of my colleagues from NCSL's Washington, D.C. office who have expertise in different areas of infrastructure. We have a lot to cover, but we'll try and keep our formal comments to about 40 minutes, leaving the remaining time for Q&A. We encourage you to put your questions in the chat as you think of them. Given the size of the infrastructure bill, I want all of our listeners to know that this is just our first in a series of briefings. Future events will be more issue specific, and all briefings will be recorded and posted on NCSL's webpage. So let's get started with a bird's eye view. As you saw on the previous slide, the law is 2,700 pages and covers what are considered major core infrastructure areas as listed on this slide. The next slide shows a great graphic from the New York Times. And while the purpose of the graphic was to tell the story of how the bill at the time when it passed the Senate was much smaller compared to what President Biden initially proposed, it does a great job of showing us how we can group the new dollars being provided into these larger buckets or areas. Bottom line, the bill provides, yes, $1 trillion in spending, but contains $550 billion in new spending, with the remaining being a continuation of existing funding. But let me hand it over to Ben Hush, who can put into context what that means, at least for transportation. Ben?
Thank you so much, Molly. And before I get actually into the transportation details of the bill, I think it's kind of important to set a baseline and provide a bit of background on existing federal funding for transportation. And I apologize if this is a repeat for some. I'll try and be as quick as possible. But generally, the federal government attempts to pass multi-year transportation authorizations that cover the gamut of transportation modes, so surface, water, aviation. Of course, with surface transportation, including roads, transit, rail, being significantly larger than the other ones. Now, for surface transportation, Congress last passed a 5-year reauthorization in 2015 entitled Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act, or the FAST Act. In 2020, Congress actually extended this for another year until October 2021 because it was unable to reach an agreement on a reauthorization. In the spring of this year, the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, or the EPW Committee, approved its reauthorization, the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Act of 2021, or STRA. Now, you might be wondering, why am I talking about a bill passed by a single Senate committee? Well, hopefully unsurprisingly, because the infrastructure bill began in the Senate and was not changed at all by the House, the surface transportation provisions match the STRA very, very closely. And this is actually a great thing for states because the STRA, which is now the infrastructure law, is a very strong bill for states. It provides significant percentage of its funding through formulas to states rather than competitive grants or funds to local governments. It also includes significantly new less requirements on spending compared to on those funds compared to the bill that was approved by the House. Okay, so let's get into the numbers. Earlier, Molly highlighted a great chart showing that roads and bridges would receive $110 billion in new funding. But overall, when you add in the existing funding, the bill provides $350 billion just for roads and bridges. Now, on the right side of the slide, you will see a chart which shows state by state amounts that the bill provides through the existing federal aid highway program. Now, the federal aid highway program is made up primarily of a few core programs that provide funds to states, and technically it's actually states are reimbursed. But each program has a slightly different goal, though there is some overlap and states can transfer a small amount of funds from between these core programs. But why I love this chart is it really shows how significant the increase is in federal aid highway funds to states. From FY 2021 to FY 2022, we'd see a 20+% increase. And then over the next 4 years of the bill, because the bill is 5 years, we'd see just over 2% in annual increases for an approximate increase of around 30% over the life of the bill. However, what this chart does not include are some of the new formula programs outside of the existing federal aid highway program that you may have heard about, including the new $40 billion bridge program. So this new $40 billion bridge program has two core parts: formula funding to states and a competitive program. Thankfully, the formula funding to states is much larger at $27.5 billion, or nearly 2/3 of the entire program. Now, the amount your state will get is based on the condition of your bridges and how many are in different states of repair, and that will determine the amount that states receive to rehab or replace or potentially replace those bridges. Now, the competitive part of the bridge program will also allow states to apply for those funds, but it will also allow local governments to submit applications. So in addition to the new bridge program, the bill also includes a new $5 billion National Electric Vehicle Formula Program, which of course provides funds to states for the implementation of EV charging infrastructure. The Protect program is a new formula program, again for states, geared towards, probably guess it, protecting surface transportation infrastructure by improving its resiliency. The Carbon Formula Program provides federal funds to, you guessed it, help reduce carbon emissions through such projects as traffic management, public transit, and many others. I'm not going to go through the entire list now. So when you combine the Formula Bridge Program with these additional formula programs I just mentioned, with the existing federal aid highway programs, you begin to get a sense of the minimum that your state will have access to for roads and bridges. Now, I say minimum because, of course, there are a number of competitive grant programs which could provide additional funds for your state. Now, for public transit, the primary point I want to leave you all with here is both the scale of the investment. If you remember that first chart that Molly showed you, the bill provides $40 billion in new funding for transit. But overall and in total, the bill provides $90 billion, which is the largest ever investment in public transit. However, for states, it is important to know that much of these federal formulas for transit operates much more on a federal to local structure. And really the only program that consistently is run by states is actually the Federal Transit Administration Rural Transit Program. Whereas the largest federal formula transit program, the urbanized area, is much more of a federal to locally focused program. And as you can see, or hopefully you can see the chart at the bottom, there are hundreds of localities that receive funding through the urbanized area program. And that Excel chart, if you can make it out, is already at line 550, and we're not all the way through. And for those curious, that chart is actually specifically from a apportionment chart that the Federal Transit Administration released following the CARES Act passage in the spring of 2020. So similar to public transit, the amount of funding included for passenger rail is quite substantial. $66 billion in total that is split between the Northeast Corridor, which is generally Washington, D.C. to Boston, and what is referred to as the national network, which is everything else. So of this $66 billion, Amtrak would directly receive about $22 billion, with another $36 billion as part of a competitive process for rail projects through what is termed the Federal State Partnership for Intercity Passenger Rail Grants. Now, states, along with local governments and Amtrak itself, can apply for that $36 billion pool. There is a separate $5 billion pool also in competitive grants for rail safety infrastructure. So the last 2 points I'll mention fairly quickly. Aviation was another area to receive fairly substantial appropriations in the bill, $15 billion in formula funding for the Airport Improvement Program, $5 billion for airport terminals, and $5 billion for federal aviation facilities. Then finally on transportation, for water transportation, which again is an area we don't really see funds flow through state government generally, but the inland waterway system, which I know is important to a lot of states, will receive just over $9.5 billion for Army Corps of Engineers infrastructure priorities. And specifically that $9.5 billion is split just a little over $5 billion for construction projects for infrastructure that was actually previously approved by Congress, but was not funded. And about $4 billion of that $9.5 billion or so is for existing infrastructure. Additionally, ports, both land and water, would receive just over $6 billion. So that's a quick intro into the transportation infrastructure funding. And now I'm going to turn it over to Trace to discuss some broadband.
Well, thanks, Ben, and good afternoon, everyone. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act provided $65 billion in new federal funding for broadband infrastructure, and it establishes a variety of new programs that direct funding toward broadband deployment and affordability. The most significant funding is allocated for a program called the Broadband Equity, Access, and Deployment Program that will be administered by the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, which I will from here on out refer to as NTIA, so we don't have all of these long phrases. And the NTIA is an agency within the Department of Commerce. So the Broadband Equity, Access, and Deployment Program is a program that through formula-based grants will distribute about $42.5 billion in broadband funding to the states. The states will then in turn competitively award grants to various subgrantees to support broadband infrastructure, mapping, and deployment. So the application process is still very fluid at this point. We'll be looking for updated guidance from NTIA in the coming months, but right now this is what we know. So NTIA must issue what is called a notice of funding opportunity for the program within 180 days of the bill's enactment, which is 6 months. And that would fall on May 15th, 2022 of next year at the latest. In my conversations with the Commerce Department, they expect it to be pretty close to taking up that full 6 months before the notice of funding opportunity is made available. So we should anticipate April or May of next year. When it is, the notice will essentially establish a process for states to apply for funding by submitting a letter of intent, as well as an initial proposal and eventually a final proposal explaining the state's plan on how they're going to use the funds. And that process will be based on a template that the NTIA will provide. So the states will have kind of a framework to work off of. And prior to the notice of funding opportunity being finalized, the department has pledged to hold meetings with all types of various stakeholders and take comments on how the notice should be best designed. So NCSL will be heavily involved in all of those discussions. So what type of funding is available in that program? The law basically designates 3 different categories of funding to individual states. The first pot of money is about $5.3 billion, and it's simply the minimum allotment that states will receive, which is to say every single state will receive $100 million from this program for broadband funding, no questions asked, no application needed. and an additional $100 million will be given equally among various U.S. territories as well. The second category is for high cost funding, and that equals about $4.25 billion. And that will be allocated for broadband projects on unserved locations and high cost areas in each state. And that will be determined by NTIA based on a variety of factors that are laid out in the law, such as poverty, geographic remoteness, low population density, and a bunch of other metrics. The third and largest category is for unserved area funding, which totals a little over $32 billion. And that will simply be allocated for broadband projects based on any unserved locations in every state in the country. So once a state's application is accepted, NTIA will release high cost funding and unserved funding to the states. And that will be based on various formulas that are defined in the bill. And essentially what they do is it will compare the number of high cost and unserved areas in a given state against the national average. Now, that's a little simplistic. It's more complex than that, but that's kind of the general idea. Another thing I should mention is that while states will be the primary entities receiving and working for the funding through the federal government, the program does require a substantial amount of coordination with local governments within each state. So for example, each state will be required to submit a 5-year action plan to the NTIA, and that plan must be a collaboration with local governments. There is also a matching requirement for the program, which is that a state must provide, or they must require a subgrantee to provide a matching contribution that's equal to at least 25% of the project cost. Now, in general, the match must come from non-federal funds, although the NTIA can waive the matching requirement for high-cost areas if a state asks it to. The bill also requires states to prioritize grants to unserved areas, number one, followed by underserved areas, and then eventually to eligible anchor institutions such as schools, libraries, churches, and other entities like that. And the definitions on unserved and underserved is simply based on the speed of broadband that I can talk about later, and that is also defined in the bill. So the infrastructure law also expanded a current FCC program that's called the Emergency Broadband Benefit, and except it renamed it. So now it's called the Affordable Connectivity Program and was allocated a little over $14 billion. What this program does is it basically provides a monthly subsidy for low-income families to purchase any internet service of their choosing without having to submit to credit checks. And it requires participating providers to carry out kind of like public awareness campaigns to help promote the program. However, it's important to note that the monthly benefit is actually reduced from $50 a month down to $30 a month with that program. The law also includes $2.75 billion in funding under the Digital Equity Act of 2021, which basically creates two different types of grant programs that will be administered by the Department of Commerce. The first is a capacity grant program, which provides grants to states for the development of state digital equity plans, which many states have already been working on. And there's also a $250 million per year competitive grant program, which more narrowly focuses on certain population types or certain communities, such as veterans, senior citizens, various minority groups, and others. The last thing I'll mention is the infrastructure law established a $1 billion grant program at NTIA for the construction and improvement of middle mile infrastructure on a competitive basis to eligible entities. And the bill basically prioritizes funding for middle mile infrastructure because it's so expensive to serve households in unserved areas. And it requires that the build out be completed within 5 years of a grant being made. It's also important to note that the amount of a middle mile grant to an eligible entity cannot exceed 70% of the total project cost. So that's very important. That was a very quick overview of all the broadband programs, and we will continue to engage with our federal partners as each program becomes available and keep everyone updated. I'm now going to turn it over to Kristen to talk about the water infrastructure and environment provisions.
Thank you, Trace. So as many of you may already be aware, the bill contained tens of billions of dollars for water infrastructure, much of which aligned with the Senate's Drinking Water and Wastewater Infrastructure Act that passed in spring of 2021. So of that 55 billion provided for water and wastewater infrastructure, 12 billion was included for the Environmental Protection Agency's Drinking Water State Revolving Fund and its Clean Water State Revolving Fund, both of which are key state-federal partnerships and are formula programs. The Drinking Water State Revolving Loan Fund was established in 1996 and acts as a financial assistance program to help water systems and states achieve the health protection objectives of the Safe Drinking Water Act, and is often used to improve water treatment, repair old pipes, and improving the source of water supply, just to name a few of those allowable uses. While the Clean Water State Revolving Fund was established prior to that in 1987, and is also a financial assistance program for a wide range of water infrastructure projects, including the creation of municipal wastewater facilities, controlling non-point sources of pollution, and green infrastructure, just to name a few. Both the CWSRF and the DWSRF will require a 10% state match. In addition to those traditional SRF activities, the bill does provide $15 billion for lead service line replacement projects and associated activities, and $10 billion for PFAS and other emerging contaminants to be distributed through those existing SRF programs. So those will come as a formula as well. For the $15 billion that's dedicated to lead service line replacement, 100% of that is for lead service line replacement. If a state doesn't have a use for the lead allocation, which would be rare, but it is redistributed to other states using the SRF formula for the purposes of that replacement. Corrosion control treatments are not eligible for funding via this new portion. Notably, states are also not required to provide a cost share, and 49% of that funding will be administered as grants and completely forgivable loans. While we're on the topic of lead service lines, the bill also extends the EPA grant program to support the replacement of lead water lines and increases its annual authorization by $40 million to $100 million for 5 years, and also authorizes over $200 million over 5 years to address lead contamination in schools via testing and remediation efforts. The $10 billion that's also provided to address PFAS and other emerging contaminants does not require states to provide a cost share either, and it does require that a minimum 49% of that funding to be administered as grants. I know many of you on the line today have worked towards PFAS research, mitigation, and cleanup in your states and have looked to what sorts of funding EPA has. This will help. While EPA has not yet released those state-by-state allocation tables for either pot of traditional SRF funding or the new lead and PFAS/emerging contaminants funding, they've assured us and other state and local groups that they are working to roll those out as soon as possible. To continue, I've also listed a few other prominent water areas in the bill on the next slide, but in the interest of time, I won't run through them all. So if you have any questions on one that I don't touch on, I'm happy to answer them at the close or follow up with folks offline. Given its unique hydrological needs, Western Water Infrastructure is currently set to receive $8.3 billion over 5 years via the Department of Interior's Bureau of Reclamation for a variety of uses, including $3.2 billion for aging infrastructure, $1.15 for water and groundwater storage, around $1 billion for water recycling and reuse, $1 billion for rural water projects, and then additional funding for dam safety, drought contingency plans, and other desalination type projects. Additionally, the bill would allow states to use those COVID-19 fiscal recovery funds to satisfy those non-federal matching requirements for the Bureau of Reclamation water projects. The bill also has $1.4 billion for combined sewer overflows, with $280 million annually available for 5 years to states to support municipal planning and construction of projects with address CSOs, with a caveat that at least 25% of the state's funding is allocated to rural or financially disadvantaged communities. Additionally, while the bill reauthorizes the Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act program. It's a federal credit program for eligible water and wastewater infrastructure projects that has been reauthorized through 2026 at the current funding level of $50 million annually. And then finally, although it's modest, the bill also includes $50 million to support state efforts to gain primacy over underground injection wells via the Safe Drinking Water Act. There are 6 classes of those wells, and I won't run through them all, but as of right now, North Dakota and Wyoming are the only states with primacy over all classes. 33 states have primacy over all except carbon sequestration wells. 8 states regulate only oil and gas wells, and then EPA actually oversees all wells in 7 states. With that, I'll move on to discuss environmental remediation provisions that are included in the bills. So the bill includes $21 billion investment to clean up Superfund and brownfield sites, reclaim abandoned mine lands, and cap orphan oil and gas wells. EPA Superfund program would receive $3.5 billion to invest in cleanups and continue with remedial actions for Superfund sites. The section also waives the state cost share requirements. For brownfields in particular, $1.5 billion will be distributed over 5 years for state and tribal assistance grants, really allowing states to assess, clean up, and reuse contaminated properties. The majority of that funding is going to be provided via competitive grants, while the remainder will be allocated via categorical grants, which all state cost share requirements are waived. As you can see, there's also a substantial amount of funding for abandoned mine land reclamation fund, and also to plug, remediate, and reclaim orphaned oil and gas wells on federal, state, and tribal lands. With that, I'm going to turn things back over to my colleague, Ben Hush, who you heard from earlier, to discuss the energy provisions within the bill.
Great. Thank you so much, Kristen. So the bill covers a number of infrastructure areas within, or I should say, a number of areas within energy infrastructure. Though actually the most significant provision is not actually a funding provision. Unfortunately, the bill does reduce state authority when it comes to electric transmission infrastructure siting. Having some technical issues here. Oh, there we go. Potentially allowing for the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to overrule a state's decision if the federal Department of Energy determines that that transmission line is part of what is known as the National Interstate Electric Transmission Corridor. So staying within electric transmission, actual federal funding in the bill includes a new small grant program, $10 million a year through fiscal year 2026, but a much larger $2.5 billion loan program through the Treasury Department. Now, those loans and grants are aimed at supporting construction of non-federal electric transmission lines. Now, more directly for states, the bill provides a one-time $500 million allotment for DOE's existing state energy program, which provides federal funds to states for a host of energy-related issues, from planning, efficiency, energy security, and many others that I'm not going to go through all here. Additionally, the bill creates a new formula program for states to help improve electric grid resiliency and prevent outages. It's authorized at $500 million per year, but it does include a required 15% state match. And similar to what we heard from Kristen, we have not yet seen those state-by-state allocation tables from the Department of Energy like we have from the U.S. Department of Transportation. So another major existing DOE program that runs through states is actually DOE's Weatherization Assistance Program, which the bill provides another $3.5 billion. The program provides funds to both states and tribes through formulas to aid in the reduction of energy costs for low-income households by increasing energy efficiency of their homes. Now, similarly, the existing low-income Housing Energy Assistance Program, or LIHEAP, which is actually administered by the Federal Department of Health and Human Services, would receive $500 million over the course of 5 years to help fund home energy assistance programs for households in needs. However, overall, where we see most of the energy-related funds going are towards federal research. Now, specifically, the bill provides $6 billion for battery research, both relating to battery materials as well as manufacturing and, of course, eventually, hopefully, recycling. It provides $6 billion for research into carbon capture, as well as $8 billion for hydrogen research, and just over $3 billion for research into advanced nuclear reactors. And that actually reminds me of one point relating to nuclear energy. One item that I really want to point out for folks relating to current energy infrastructure is a $6 billion fund to help maintain the country's fleet of existing nuclear reactors. And these existing reactors provide just under 20, probably about 19% of the nation's electricity. And of course, all of that is at zero carbon emissions. But that's really it for energy. So I'm actually going to turn it over to Nicole to discuss some of the bill's disaster provisions.
Thanks, Ben. So the bill provides funding for states and localities to address important disaster resilience and mitigation programs. I'm going to quickly run through the ways the bill changes the Stafford Act, as well as hand things back to Kristen to discuss FEMA's disaster grant programs. So a notable states is the amendment to the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act, more colloquially known as the Stafford Act, which provides the legal authority for the federal government to provide technical, financial, logistical, and other assistance to states and localities during declared major disasters or emergencies. The amendment is pretty notable because it expands eligibilities within the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program to include the replacement or installation of wildfire resilient electrical transmission, sorry, lots of words here. Wildfire resilient electrical transmissions or utility poles. The program provides vital funding to states, territories, and tribes following major disaster declarations to make resilience improvements. Generally, the cost share for these grants is 75% federal and 25% non-federal. However, for insular areas such as Guam, Northern Mariana Islands, the US Virgin Islands, and American Samoa, FEMA may waive the non-federal cost share. Now, I'm going to turn things back over to Kristen so she can talk about the FEMA grant programs that are going to be changing. Kristen?
Thanks, Nicole. So Nicole talked about the Stafford Act a little bit. I'm going to go into what's provided under the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So FEMA provides states with a variety of funds to assist not only post-disaster, but also with mitigation efforts. So kind of going into those programs below, we have flood mitigation. So the bill provides $3.5 billion over 5 years to states to fund FEMA's flood mitigation assistance grants, which is a competitive grant program that provides funds to states and local governments for projects that reduce or eliminate the risk of repetitive flood damage to buildings, which are insured by the National Flood Insurance Program via buyouts, elevation, or other mitigating activities. Additionally, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Program, which replaced FEMA's pre-disaster mitigation program, was funded at $1 billion over 5 years. That program specifically provides funding to states and local governments to strengthen the resilience of critical infrastructure, such as transportation, energy, water supply, and communications. And then a new addition for states, the bill fully funds the STORM Act, fully known as the Safeguarding Tomorrow Through Ongoing Risk Mitigation Act, which will provide state and local governments with the ability to create resilience revolving loan funds, which I know a couple of states have already been looking into, for infrastructure projects that would protect against catastrophic events, including wildfires, earthquakes, flooding, etc. Those revolving loan funds will model EPA's SRFs that I talked about a little bit earlier, and NCSL will be working with our federal partners to ensure that states are afforded flexibility in utilizing those funds and also can make full use of those. With that, I turn things on over to my colleague, Susan Frederick.
Thanks, Kristen, and thanks to Nicole. I'm going to tell you a little bit about a brand new grant program, the State and Local Cyber Grant Program. And this is the first dedicated cybersecurity funding vehicle for states and localities to upgrade their cyber infrastructure, and has been something that NCSL and our state and local partners have advocated for over the last several years. So it's kind of a big deal. The grant will be administered by FEMA in consultation with the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, which is also a part of the Department of Homeland Security. It will give $1 billion to states, localities and tribes beginning in FY 2022 through FY 2025. Local jurisdictions will have to receive 80% of the state allocation, with 25% of that going to rural jurisdictions. States will have 45 days after the receipt of the state funds to distribute their funding to localities. To receive the grant dollars, states must submit a cybersecurity plan to DHS CISA that contains a description of any existing cyber plans an explanation of how the state will manage, monitor, and track information systems, including legacy IT systems, an overview of how the state will enhance preparation, response, and resiliency of IT systems against risks and threats, and how it will use best practices. And also, how will states plan to implement a process for continuous cyber vulnerability assessments and threat mitigation practices. When states receive their grant funds, they must establish a cyber planning committee and include stakeholders such as local representatives from local jurisdictions, from tribal jurisdictions, if they have any in their state, and at least half of the folks on the planning committee have to have an expertise in cybersecurity. There is a state match, which you can see on the slide. The federal share begins in FY22 at 200 million, increases to 400 million in 23, 300 million in 2024, and 100 million in FY 2025. The distribution will be by formula based on population and also based on population in rural areas. The state match, and this is the important piece, cannot be an in-kind match. So it will require a legislative appropriation to go through that process. Prohibited uses of grant funds are listed on the slide. Most importantly, you cannot use grant funds to pay for ransomware attacks on your systems. CISA is going to be contacting state groups in particular to answer any questions and to get input on guidance and regulations for implementation. And with that, I think we are rounded up here and can move on to the Q&A.
Great, thanks, Susan, and everyone on NCSL staff. And we kept ourselves right between 35 and 40 minutes on our presentation. And I hope that at least was helpful in providing you the highlights of the program. And what we'd like now is we're going to go through a few of the questions that were provided in the chat. And I think I'm going to kind of jump to the bottom only because Susan mentioned with the cybersecurity grants that there was a match. How about for other people, other NCSL staff? Do any of you know off the top of your head about matches that are required for your spending categories?
So Molly, for transportation, what I would say is most of the transportation funds go through existing programs. Generally, that match ranges anywhere from 20 to 50%. But again, most of these programs are existing. So the match component is kind of already built into the system, if you will.
Thanks, Ben. Did anyone else want to add anything?
And then Molly, I can add in on the water side. Sorry, let me start my video. Those clean water and drinking water SRF funding, the traditional amounts, so those 11.7, $12 billion amounts that I mentioned earlier, will require a 10% state match. They're the only ones in that water sector that will.
Thanks, Kristen. All right, I'm going to go on to another kind of general question to the group, which again, it may vary depending on the category of infrastructure. What role is there, if any, for state legislatures to authorize the spending or appropriate the funding that goes to the state? Does the bill require participation by legislatures or go directly to the executive branch or local governments? And maybe we could put it in the context of the new programs, because most of the existing programs that will go through the existing process. Do we know anything yet about that, whether it's going to have to go through the legislature or whether it will go straight to the executive branch? And Ben, since you have the largest pot of money, why don't we start with transportation?
Sure. So actually, I think Susan actually made a great comment in terms of requiring new appropriations by the legislature. And I guess I will summarize this as it's really up to the state. If the legislature wants to play a more active role, it's going to need to pass legislation to do that. Or if it would rather have the executive branch agency to take on more control, it can also allow for that. So my comment would be it's generally up to the individual state. And a good example that, or I guess maybe examples, because we saw this on a scale with when it came to COVID aid, was how states responded to some of the aid that was provided in the CARES Act or the American Rescue Plan, and the laws that some states passed to change how federal aid was distributed by the state.
Thanks, Ben. All right, Ben, since we have you, I'm going to go on and ask an EV question. And I think you may have seen it in the feed. And if you could answer, do we know how flexible this EV infrastructure funding is? How much flexibility states have? Hold on one sec. We're just going to mute a line here. I think we got it under control here. How can organization assist, partner with state governments in getting the word out about the grant?
Sure. So thank you for that question. The EV question is the EV program is definitely new. So we're still kind of waiting for some specifics from actually from the Department of Transportation. This is not a DOE program. But generally what I would say is funds provided by DOT are to be used primarily for costs associated with the acquisition, the installation, network connection, data sharing, operation and maintenance of EV charging infrastructure. Funds will be provided to states on or my understanding is on a proportionate basis, kind of calculated in a fairly similar manner as other federal formula funds to states, with again, and to answer, I guess, some other questions within this, with 80% of each projects to be covered by federal funds, but would require a 20% match by the state. States are permitted to use funds to contract with a private entity for the acquisition and installation of EV charging infrastructure. And the private entity is actually permitted to pay the applicable state share for cost of a project. So my understanding is if the state wanted to contract with a private entity, they could cover that, say, 20% that is required in order to access that 80% of federal funds.
Thanks, Ben. Trace, for you, when will the $2.75 billion from the Digital Equity Act funding be made available for states?
That's a good question. I think that because it's a newer program, just like the broadband equity program, that's the $42 billion. With new programs, there's always a kind of a startup time. So I would guess, for the digital equity part, I mean, you're probably looking at 3 to 4 months from now, because it's smaller. It's a smaller pot of money. I don't think it'll take too long, but I would guess probably 3 to 4 months, potentially shorter.
Thanks. And while we're on that topic, is there, or what broadband speed does the bill set as a minimum, if it does, and what will make an underserved area no longer underserved? Are we able to answer that at this point?
Yeah, so an unserved area is basically any area that has below, this is getting technical, 25 download and 3 upload speeds by megabits per second, which is a bunch of jargon, but for folks that work on broadband, if it's below 25 download, 3 upload megabits per second speed, then it's considered unserved. And underserved is defined as below 100 download, 20 upload megabits per second. So, and there's obviously various ways to test that, but those are the official broadband speed definitions to delineate between an unserved area and an underserved area.
Great, thanks. Kristen, on water, what terms or conditions are there on well plugging, if you can answer this, if a state accepts the oil and gas well plugging money?
So we don't have an answer for that yet. We are communicating with Department of Interior to figure out what, if any, requirements would be required by a state. In recent years, states have, really increased their appropriations across the board. And I won't say all states, for states with abandoned oil and gas wells, to kind of mitigate these problems, with an average cost somewhere being around $5,000 per well. So it is something that we have states across the nation looking at doing. So we will find an answer and hopefully hear back from DFI soon.
Thanks, Kristen. And actually, I had it under the wrong category. Here's your water question for you. Is there money for wastewater infrastructure?
Yeah, so there's a significant amount of funding for wastewater, both via the Clean Water SRF. I know it's a little bit of a misnomer, but it falls under wastewater treatment, sewer rehabilitation, wastewater reuse, wastewater treatment systems, et cetera. And then for under that PFAS $10 billion bucket that I talked about earlier, there's $1 billion of that is dedicated solely towards PFAS and other emerging contaminants in wastewater. So there's a significant amount of funding throughout the bill that can be used for wastewater focused projects.
Great, thank you. I see a question in the chat about jurisdictions that need to build up their workforces to implement these initiatives. Are there funds for training, develop a workforce? And I see that Susan did reply that there is some funding there in the cybersecurity area. How about the other areas of infrastructure? Are there any funds that you're aware of, or are the funds flexible enough to be able to work for used for some type of workforce development?
Molly, on transportation, I'd have to check and get back to the question.
Okay.
For broadband, not that I'm aware of. I think most of the funding will go directly to the state, which they can then, grant out to certain eligible entities that presumably already have the expertise. And there's a checklist of requirements, that the company or whoever has to have. The technical expertise to do whatever they're trying to do. In this case, deploy broadband infrastructure. I don't know of anything workforce development related, but I can look further into that too.
Okay, we can look into that and get back to individuals. Ben, somebody had joined late and just had a question about, as it relates to the transportation programs, do we know the sub-allocation requirements yet or not?
So we do for the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, which is the largest program that requires sub-allocation. It's actually of the fund. So it's the second largest program within the federal aid highway program. And of the funds a state receives, 55% of those have to be sub-allocated to local areas. And the percentages differ depending upon the size of that local area. But one important thing for NCSL and for other state groups was it was I don't want to say battle, but it was a point of negotiation over how much that percentage would change. It existed prior to this bill at 55%. And I will say there were a number of local groups that wanted to increase that further. But thankfully, the STRA and then eventually the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act maintained the 55%.
Great, thanks, Ben. I have another question on the transportation. Who does the bridge funding go? Does it go directly to states or can locals apply as well? How's the bridge funding work?
So it's both. So 27.5 or about 2/3 of the $40 billion will go to states. There's 12.5 billion that is competitive, and local governments, in addition to state governments, can also apply for that. So again, both, but states will have access to a significantly larger portion.
Great, thank you. I do see there's a lot of chatter about the legislative versus executive control of the funding. And, this is something NCSL tracks really closely as to, who has authority over this, and it also has to do whether they anticipated, unanticipated, whether states are in and out of session. And we have people in our fiscal staff who track this much closer, and we can obviously get back to individuals who have additional questions. Trace, I'm going to go back to you. Someone said they may have missed something and maybe you see it there at the end. Sorry if this got answered, but is a broadband 5-year plan required for all of the new broadband programs? Is it like a condition of funding?
So my understanding is that for the 5-year plan, that is part of the short for the BEAD program, so the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, which is the major broadband program in this infrastructure bill. It's the one that was funded at $42 billion. And that's the main one. So for the BEAD program, a 5-year plan, which is also the formula-based grants program, that is the 5-year plan is required, and the details of that will be forthcoming. But when the guidance comes out, like I kind of mentioned earlier, when a state applies, they'll send in a letter of intent to apply for the program funding, and then they'll submit an initial plan, and then they'll be able to kind of revise that and submit a final plan to the NTIA that will include a 5-year plan on how they plan to use the funding to expand broadband. And then there are various reporting requirements, both by the state and any sub-grantee or company that receives the funding from the state to expand it. There will be various reporting requirements back to the NTIA on who are they, what areas are they serving, what communities are they serving, what are the broadband speeds that are being implemented in those areas to make sure that everything is meeting the requirements as laid out in the law. So for the BEAD program, the big broadband program, a 5-year plan, to my knowledge, will be required.
Thanks, Trace. And since I have you, a couple people have kind of brought this up. Some incumbent cable companies are promoting fixed wireless as a recommendation for broadband if it's not fiber, it's not broadband. Will NTIA and feds allow this to qualify for broadband and approval for federal dollars?
That's a good question. I don't know for sure the answer to it. I do know that fixed wireless companies have taken are using the emergency broadband benefit program that the FCC is currently running. It's the one that I mentioned earlier that had the name changed, but it provides the monthly subsidy to low-income families. So a lot of fixed wireless companies are participating in that program. That's not the same as the main BEAD program. That's the $42 billion. I don't know the answer for sure, but I suspect that one of the issues could be is a lot of fixed wireless goes to one specific location, which for the emergency monthly subsidy program, is helpful because you're helping a family or whoever in their home acquire broadband access. When it's on a much broader scale, when you're covering a large amount of land area, I don't know if NTIA would go for that. It's also possible that if the fixed wireless provider meets the broadband speed requirements at upgrading it from unserved to underserved, or just making sure that it's the appropriate level, they could qualify. But I don't know for sure, and so that's something that I can inquire with the Department of Commerce about.
Thanks, Trace. This again is a question for everyone. Someone has raised the issue, obviously, kind of they use it or lose it. What's the time frame on spending a lot of these dollars? And I guess we could do this kind of one by one if you're prepared to answer. Ben, we can start with you. And I know you've got kind of separate pots of money too, so.
Sure. Well, the easier pot is transportation because, again, a lot of those are existing funds. And actually, the Federal Highway Administration actually has a process, what is called the August redistribution, which basically looks at how much a state or territory got or received in that specific year. And if they have not spent down a certain percentage of it, they pool all of those funds and redistribute them for I guess I will say for access for other states if they want to make use of them between August and the end of the fiscal year, which again, for the federal government is September 30th.
Great.
And that's an annual process.
Thanks. Does anyone else? A time frame want to provide?
So specifically on the water side, the bill does specifically outline for that $15 billion in lead service line replacement funding. It's not whether or not it's used or lose. If a state does not have the capability, if it's not included in their plans to replace lead service lines, that funding is then reallocated amongst other states.
Great. And what is the time frame for the reallocation? Do you remember?
We don't have it listed yet, but we're
Okay.
hoping for more guidance on that.
Okay, great. Like I said, this is just our first review. We'll be diving in a lot deeper on some of the details. Somebody asked a broad question about research NCSL is doing on workforce shortages, supply chain. We'll have to get back to you on that. You know, our Denver office does a lot of work on what's going on in states, and we can circle back with you on in response to that. Let me see. I think that wraps up our questions. Unless anyone else, NCSL staff, did you see that I missed anything or we got them all? All right, it looks like we have gone through all our questions and our time has about run out. If you come up with any question in the next few minutes or soon, you know, please feel free or over the next few days to reach out. You've got the NCSL staff contact information on the screen. My colleague has already also posted, and I can ask her to do it again, a PDF of the slides from today. As I mentioned, this is our first briefing for legislators and legislative staff. We are going to do a series of them, really diving in on other issues. I do have or can share with you that the next one will be on November 29th, and the topic will be cybersecurity. So please keep an eye on your inbox for registration information. Again, we thank you for joining us here at and on behalf of all of us here at NCSL, have a wonderful Thanksgiving holiday. Bye.